The Valdorei War beast compound sat behind thick stone walls at the edge of a wide, flat plain. The walls were old and dark, scorched in places by beast fire and scratched deep by claws that had grown too large for any normal cage to hold. The ground inside was hard-packed dirt, worn smooth by years of heavy feet. Chains as thick as a man's wrist hung from iron posts driven into the earth. The whole place smelled of something wild and sharp. The kind of smell that made a person's body want to move away before their mind caught up. It was not a place built for comfort. It was built for one thing only: to turn living creatures into weapons. The Valdorei were tall, broad-shouldered beings with gray skin and flat, pale eyes that missed very little. They had been breeding and training war beasts for longer than most civilizations had been writing things down. They were good at it. They were precise and patient and completely without sentiment when it came to the creatures in their care. A beast was a tool. A tool had to be shaped. That was the work, and the Valdorei did the work well. Sorvek was the head trainer. He had been doing this job for over 20 years, and it showed in the way he moved, careful, measured, always aware of where every living thing in the yard was at any given moment. He was not a large man by Valdorei standards, but he had a stillness about him that commanded attention. Junior handlers watched him the way young soldiers watch a veteran. He did not raise his voice often. He did not need to. That morning he stood in the center of the training yard with his arms folded and his eyes on the far enclosure. Inside it, a creature paced. The Grakens were the war beasts the Valdorei trained. They were enormous, 4 thick legs, a spine lined with raised bone plates, a broad heavy skull, and eyes that burned amber in low light. A juvenile like the one in the far enclosure stood close to 2 meters at the shoulder. A fully grown Graken was nearly twice that. They were not simply large. They were built in every part of their body for one purpose, and that purpose was destruction. The juvenile in the far pen had been given the designation Reth. Reth was 14 months old. By the training schedule the compound used, he should have been past the early aggression stage by now. He should have been responding to basic commands. He should have been manageable, at least in part, with the right handlers and the right tools. He was none of those things. He had broken 2 handling poles in the first month. He had injured a junior handler badly enough that the man had been pulled from active yard duty for 3 weeks. He had refused every bonding attempt the compound tried: food conditioning, scent pairing, proximity training. None of it worked. He paced his enclosure from one end to the other in long, tight loops, head low, spine plates half raised, amber eyes tracking everything that moved with a sharp and restless attention that made even experienced handlers uneasy. Sorvek had worked with difficult juveniles before. He had never worked with one quite like Reth. He watched the juvenile pace and said nothing. There was not much to say. The morning session was not due to start for another hour, and for now he was simply observing, taking stock of the creature's mood, looking for any small shift in behavior that might tell him something useful. He had been doing this every morning for weeks. So far the creature had told him very little except that it did not want to be here and it did not trust anyone it saw. Behind Sorvek, across the wide open ground of the yard, a group of humans moved along the far wall. There were 12 of them, part of a labor arrangement between the Valdorei Council and the human settlements to the south. The agreement was simple. The humans provided workers for low-level compound tasks, hauling feed, cleaning pens, maintaining the outer structures. The Valdorei provided housing and a wage. It was a practical arrangement. The compound was large and the handlers had more important things to do than carry grain sacks from the storage block to the beast pens. The humans kept to themselves. They were quiet and careful and they stayed well away from the enclosures unless their work required them to be near one. They had been told on their first day exactly what the Grakens were capable of, and none of them had needed to be told twice. They did their routes, completed their tasks, and kept their eyes forward. Sorvek barely registered them most mornings. They were simply part of the background of the compound, like the chains and the iron posts and the smell of the yard. One of the 12 was a young woman named Anna. She was perhaps 19, slight in build, with dark hair tied back simply from her face. She was not the strongest of the human workers. Frank, the older man, could carry more, but she was steady. She arrived on time every morning, completed her assigned route without shortcuts, and had not caused a single problem in the 6 months she had been at the compound. The handlers who logged the human workers' records had almost nothing written beside her name. She was unremarkable in the way that reliable people often are. That morning her route took her along the outer path that ran beside Reth's enclosure. It was a standard path. She had walked it many times. The cart she pulled had a small squeaking wheel that she had asked to have fixed twice and which had not been fixed yet. It rattled and squeaked on the hard dirt as she moved, her eyes forward, her pace steady. She was not thinking about the beast in the enclosure beside her. She was thinking about the squeaking wheel and whether the morning meal back at the workers' block would still be warm by the time she finished this run. Reth heard the cart before she reached the enclosure. He heard everything. His head came up from his low pacing posture and turned toward the fence line, amber eyes sharp and alert. He had reacted to cart sounds before. Usually with aggression, moving toward the fence and slamming his weight against it in a way that sent junior handlers scrambling backward. Sorvek, watching from across the yard, straightened slightly. Reth did not slam into the fence. He stood still for a moment, watching. Then he walked forward, not fast, not low and aggressive the way he moved when something made him angry. Just walking. Steady steps, almost slow, until he reached the iron fence and stopped. Anna had slowed her cart without quite meaning to. She looked at the creature on the other side of the fence the way a person looks at something unexpected, not with fear, but with honest attention. Reth was large and his spine plates were visible above the fence line and his amber eyes were fixed directly on her face. She did not step back. She tilted her head slightly and said, almost to herself, the only thing that came naturally to say. "Hello." Reth looked at her for one long moment. Then, with a slowness and a deliberateness that seemed almost careful, he lowered himself. All 4 legs folding. Spine plate settling. His massive body dropping until he was sitting, fully, quietly sitting, right beside the fence, as close to her as the iron would allow. Every handler in the yard stopped moving. Sorvek stood in the middle of the open ground and stared. In 14 months, through every training attempt and every handling session and every morning of observation, Reth had never done that. He had never been still for anyone. He had never offered anything except aggression or refusal. He was sitting now. Patient and calm. His amber eyes on Anna. And Sorvek, who had spent 20 years learning not to be unsettled by anything in this yard, felt something cold move through him. He did not have a name for it yet. But it was there. Sorvek did not move for a full 10 seconds. That was unusual for him. He was not a man who stood still out of confusion. In 20 years of working in this yard he had seen juveniles break restraints, seen fully grown Grakens take out sections of iron fencing, seen handlers make mistakes that cost them badly. In every one of those moments he had moved fast and thought clearly and done what needed to be done. Standing still was not something he did. But he stood still now. Reth had not moved either. The juvenile sat beside the fence line with his massive body settled and his spine plates flat and his amber eyes fixed on Anna with a steadiness that was almost strange to see in a creature that had spent 14 months being impossible to settle. He was not asleep. He was not dazed. He was simply sitting, the way a creature sits when it has decided it is exactly where it wants to be. Anna stood on the other side of the fence with one hand resting on her cart handle and her head still tilted slightly to one side. She was watching Reth with an expression that was open and calm and entirely without the kind of careful performance people put on when they were trying to manage something frightening. She was not managing anything. She was just looking at him. Sorvek finally moved. He walked forward slowly, keeping his steps quiet and even, his eyes on Reth the whole time. The junior handlers at their posts watched him move and did not speak. The yard had gone the particular kind of quiet that it only went when something was happening that no one had words for yet. As Sorvek walked, he was thinking. He was pulling up everything he knew about Kraken posture and behavior and running it against what he was seeing. The low settled body. The flat spine plates. The forward-facing stillness directed at a specific individual. He had studied these signals for 2 decades. He knew what each one meant in isolation and he knew what they meant together. Together they meant something very specific. The Valdorei called it the anchor posture. It was old, older than the formal training programs, older than the compound itself. It went back to the earliest records of Kraken behavior, back to when the creatures had run in packs across the open plains and chosen their companions the way animals chose them. Not through conditioning or reward systems, but through something that happened between one creature and another that nobody had ever fully been able to explain. A Kraken in anchor posture had made a choice. It had looked at something living and decided, in whatever way a war beast decided things, that this was its own. Handlers spent years trying to earn that posture. Most never did. Reth had given it to a human girl who had said hello. Sorvek stopped a few meters from the fence. He looked at Reth. He looked at Anna. He kept his voice flat and even when he spoke because the last thing he wanted to do right now was introduce any new tension into the air. "Step away from the fence," he said. Anna looked at him. Her expression was calm but she was clearly aware now that something was wrong, or at least that something was happening that she did not understand. "Did I do something wrong? Step away. Now." She let go of the cart handle and took one step back. Reth moved the moment she did. Not aggressively, he did not lunge or slam the fence or raise his spine plates. But a sound came out of him, low and deep, from somewhere in the center of his chest. A rumble. Not a warning. Not a threat. Something that sat between those things and something else, something that sounded almost like a question. Anna stopped moving. Every handler in the yard went still. The rumble from a juvenile Kraken was a sound people in this compound knew well. It usually meant that something was about to go badly. But this one was different in a way that was hard to name. It was not the sound Reth made before he broke something. It was a sound none of them had heard from him before. Sorvek held up one hand toward Anna without looking at her. She understood and stayed where she was. The rumble faded slowly, like thunder moving away. Reth settled again, his eyes finding Anna and fixing on her and calming. Sorvek turned to the nearest junior handler and kept his voice low and completely steady. "Go to the administrative block. Find Elder Drath. Tell him in person that I need him in the yard immediately. Do not use the channel. Go now." The junior handler left at a run. Sorvek turned back to the enclosure. Reth had not moved. Anna had not moved. The two of them were simply there on either side of the iron fence, the girl and the war beast, as if the rest of the yard did not exist. Sorvek folded his arms and waited. He did not speak to Anna again. He did not approach the fence. He did not call any of the other handlers over. He simply stood and watched and kept the space around Reth as quiet and unchanged as he could manage while he waited for Drath to arrive. Other handlers began to drift closer. Not to the fence, nobody was moving close to the fence. But to the edges of the open ground, gathering in ones and twos, watching with the careful attention of people trying to understand something they were not sure they were reading correctly. Low voices moved between them. Sorvek caught fragments. Words like impossible and never seen and what is she doing? He did not respond to any of it. He kept his eyes on Reth. Word moved faster through a compound than any runner could. By the time Elder Drath came through the yard gate, there were 6 senior handlers standing at the edge of the space and the junior handlers at their posts had all turned to face the enclosure. The yard had taken on the atmosphere of something held carefully, like a room full of people trying not to breathe too loud. Reth was older than Sorvek by many years. He was shorter and broader, and he moved with a slowness that was not the slowness of age but the slowness of a man who had learned that rushing towards something you did not understand was usually a mistake. He came through the gate and took in the scene without changing his expression. He walked to where Sorvek was standing and stopped beside him and looked at Reth. He did not speak for a long time. Reth was still sitting. Anna was still there, one step back from the fence, her cart beside her. She was looking at Reth now with the expression of someone trying to read a room they had accidentally walked into. "How long?" Reth said. His voice was quiet. "Close to 30 minutes now," Sorvek said. He walked to the fence when she passed on her route. "He sat before I reached her position. He has not moved since except when I had her step back," he rumbled. "Single occurrence. Stopped when she stopped moving." Reth was quiet again. He watched Reth. He watched Anna. He took his time. "What is her name?" he said. Sorvek checked his log. "Anna. Human labor exchange. 6 months assigned. No behavioral incidents." Reth nodded slowly. He took 2 steps closer to the fence than Sorvek was standing. Reth did not look at him. Reth's eyes stayed on Anna with the kind of focus that had nothing left over for anything else. Around them the gathered handlers had begun to talk in low urgent voices. Sorvek heard the shape of the argument forming before any of the words became clear. He had already been running the same argument in his own head. Remove the girl. Sedate the juvenile. Reset the situation to something controllable and figure out what had happened from a safe distance. One of the senior handlers, a broad man named Pell, stepped forward and said it plainly. "We should pull her out and put the juvenile under. Whatever is happening here is outside the protocol, and outside the protocol means we are outside safe margins." Several of the others made sounds of agreement. Reth did not turn around. "No," he said. The word was simple and completely final. Pell opened his mouth. Reth turned then, just enough to look at him, and whatever was in Reth's expression made Pell close his mouth again. "Nobody removes the girl," Reth said, addressing all of them without raising his voice. "Nobody sedates the juvenile. We do not touch this." He looked back at the enclosure. "We observe." Sorvek kept his arms folded. He had things to say. He would say them, but not here, not in the open yard with junior handlers listening. He would say them to Reth privately when the time was right. For now he said nothing and kept his face composed and watched Reth sitting calmly beside the fence like a creature that had never given anyone a single moment of trouble in its life. Across the fence, Anna looked from face to face among the gathered Valdorei. She was smart enough to understand that something significant was happening, even if she did not know what it was. She looked at Reth. Reth looked back at her with his amber eyes steady and soft in a way that amber eyes in a war beast's face had no business being. She did not fully understand any of it. But she stayed. The meeting happened the following morning in the observation room above the main yard. It was a small room with a long window that looked down over the training ground. The glass was thick and treated to muffle sound from below, so everything seen through it looked quiet even when it was not. 6 senior handlers stood along the window in a line. Sorvek stood at one end. Elder Reth stood at the other. Nobody sat. This was not that kind of meeting. Reth had spoken for several minutes already. He had laid out what he intended to do in the same plain and careful way he did everything, no extra words, no softening, just the plan stated clearly so that everyone in the room understood it completely. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then everyone spoke at once. Sorvek did not join the noise. He waited. When the others had said their versions of the same objection, too dangerous, outside protocol, no precedent, the juvenile is unmanageable. He said his version of it quietly and directly. If the stimulus triggers a full response, the fence will not stop him, Sorvek said. An unrestrained juvenile in full aggression with an unprotected human in the yard is not a test. It is an incident waiting to happen. She will be behind the secondary barrier, Reth said. The secondary barrier is reinforced screen. If Reth commits to a charge at full aggression, reinforced screen will not. I know what it will and will not hold, Reth said. He did not say it sharply. He said it the way a man says something when he has already considered every part of it and does not need to consider it again. Anna will be behind the barrier. Reth will be unrestrained in the open yard. If the bond is real, we will see it hold under pressure. If it is not real, we will see that too and we will act accordingly. Either way, we will know what we are dealing with. And if we are wrong, Sorvek said. Then we act fast and we deal with the consequences, Reth said simply. He looked around the room. I have been in this compound for longer than most of you. I have seen a great many things in this yard. What I saw yesterday beside that fence was not a stress response and it was not coincidence and it was not a malfunction of the juvenile's behavior pattern. What I saw was a Kraken making a choice. He paused. We are going to find out how deep that choice goes. Nobody argued further. Reth had that quality in him, not forcefulness exactly, but a kind of settled certainty that made continued argument feel like pushing against something that was not going to move. The trial was set for the following afternoon. Anna was told only that she was needed in the main yard for a compound observation exercise. She was told to wear her standard work clothes and to follow the instructions of the handlers present at all times. She was not told what the exercise involved. Reth had decided deliberately not to tell her. He did not want her to prepare or to brace herself or to perform calmness. He wanted whatever she brought into that yard to be exactly what she always brought, nothing more and nothing less. She arrived at the yard gate at the time she was given, looked at the unusual number of senior handlers standing around the observation areas, and said nothing about it. She was taken to the secondary barrier, a thick reinforced screen set along the near edge of the training ground, and positioned there with a clear line of sight across the open yard. Sorvek watched her from the observation room above. She stood behind the barrier with her hands at her sides and looked out at the empty yard with the same steady expression she seemed to carry everywhere. He could not decide if she was brave or simply did not understand enough to be frightened. He suspected it was neither. He suspected she was just herself, and that whatever that was, it was something the compound had not encountered before in quite this form. Reth was brought in on a long lead by two of the strongest handlers. He came through the far gate fast, pulling hard against the lead, spine plates raised, head swinging. The open yard was a space he associated with testing and pressure and he was already agitated before he cleared the gate. The two handlers managing the lead leaned their full weight back to slow him. He dragged them forward 3 steps before they got him stopped in the center of the yard. Then he saw Anna. He went still. Not the tense stillness of a creature holding itself back. The real kind. The sudden kind, where everything in the body just stops at once. The handlers unclipped the lead and moved clear quickly. Reth stood in the center of the open yard. Free. No chain, no lead, no restraint of any kind. The senior handlers in the observation room above collectively stopped breathing. Sorvek put one hand flat on the ledge in front of him without noticing he had done it. The first stimulus hit. A sharp, hard sound, a percussive blast from the speakers mounted in the yard walls, the kind used in combat conditioning to test aggression thresholds. It was loud enough to feel in the chest. Every Kraken in the compound reacted. From the far pens came the sounds of bodies hitting fencing and the deep warning calls of adult beasts responding to the noise. In the yard, Reth's spine plates flared upward in a single fast motion and his head snapped toward the speaker with his teeth showing. The snarl that came out of him was low and genuine and deeply unpleasant to hear. He turned his body toward the sound. His weight shifted forward onto his front legs. His amber eyes were locked on the speaker housing with the fixed, furious attention of a creature that had decided something needed to be destroyed. Behind the secondary barrier, Anna watched him. She did not step back. She did not make a sound. The second stimulus came before the first had fully faded. A scent release from the vent set into the base of the yard walls, a compound the Valdorei used to simulate the territorial marking of a rival beast. It was designed to trigger one specific response in a Kraken, and it had never failed to trigger it. Reth got the scent and something shifted in him that was visible from the observation room above. His whole body tightened. The snarl got louder. He turned from the speaker toward the scent vent and his back legs pushed down against the dirt like he was loading weight into them, and everyone watching knew what came before a charge. 3 seconds. 4. Anna said his name. She did not shout it. She did not put any particular force behind it. She said it the way she had always said it, simply and clearly, the way you say the name of someone you know. Reth. He turned. Not slowly. Not after a pause. He turned the moment the word reached him, fast and complete, the way a creature turns towards something that matters more than everything else in its field of attention. The weight came out of his back legs. The snarl stopped. His spine plates did not go fully flat. He was still tense, still breathing hard, still carrying the full load of what the stimuli had put into him, but he turned away from the scent vent and faced Anna and stayed there. His sides heaved. His eyes found her face. He did not move toward the barrier. He did not charge the vent. He did not attack the speaker housing or the yard walls or the two handlers who were standing very still near the far gate trying not to draw his attention. He stood in the center of the open yard with everything in his body still lit up from the stimuli, and he looked at Anna and he held himself still. In the observation room, nobody spoke. Sorvek stood at the window with both hands on the ledge now. He was looking at Reth. He was looking at the posture, the breathing, the spine plates, the eye focus. He was reading every signal the way he had been trained to read them over 20 years, and every single one of them was saying the same thing. The Juvenile had been at the edge of a full uncontrolled aggression response. He had been pulled back from it by one word from one person. No conditioning. No reward. No tool or technique from any training program the compound used. Just her voice saying his name. Drath stood beside Sorvek and watched for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. No handler in this compound, he said, has ever achieved that result in a double stimulus trial. Not with a juvenile of his aggression profile. Sorvek said nothing. She did not train for it, Drath said. She did not study him. She learned his name and she used it. Below them in the yard, Reth had crossed the open ground slowly and was standing close to the secondary barrier. Anna had her hand pressed flat against the screen on her side. He pressed the broad side of his head against it on his. His eyes were closed. His spine plates were fully flat. Sorvek stared at it for a long time. Then he took his hands off the ledge and straightened up and said nothing, because there was nothing left that he could say that the yard had not already answered. The decision came the morning after the trial. Drath wrote it into the compound record himself, which was unusual. Normally administrative entries were handled by the junior staff in the documentation room. But Drath sat down at the record desk that morning and wrote the entry in his own hand, carefully and completely, because he wanted it to be exact. He wrote what he had observed. He wrote what the trial had produced. He wrote his decision in plain language with no softening around it. Anna was to be given supervised access to Reth's enclosure starting the following week. He set the conditions himself. 2 handlers present at all times. Full observation logging for every session. A strict entry and exit protocol that Anna was to follow without variation. A hard limit on session length until the behavioral data gave them reason to extend it. He was careful about every detail because he was not a man who let a good result make him careless. Reth was still a juvenile Kraken. A juvenile Kraken with a bond was still a juvenile Kraken, and juvenile Krakens were still dangerous, and Reth had not kept this compound running for as long as he had by letting important facts get soft around the edges. He posted the decision on the handler board before breakfast. Sorvek read it without expression and said nothing. He had said what he had to say already. Drath had heard it and had made his decision anyway, and that was the end of it. Sorvek was not a man who fought the same argument twice. He accepted the decision, noted his objections in his own log for the record, and went to work. Anna was told that afternoon. She listened to the conditions carefully and agreed to all of them without asking for anything to be changed. She asked only one question, which was whether she was allowed to bring anything into the enclosure with her during sessions. The handler telling her asked what she had in mind. She said she was not sure yet. She just wanted to know if it was allowed. He told her to submit anything she wanted to bring to Sorvek for approval first. She nodded and thanked him and went back to her afternoon route without making anything of it. The first session was 4 days later. Anna arrived at the enclosure gate at the time she had been given. The 2 assigned handlers were already there. Reth was visible at the far end of the pen, pacing in his usual loops. He heard the gate before it opened, he always heard everything, and his head came up and turned toward the sound. When Anna stepped through the gate, Reth stopped pacing. He stood at the far end of the enclosure and looked at her. Then he walked toward her. Not fast. The same steady deliberate walk he had used at the fence on that first morning. The handlers on either side of Anna both shifted their weight slightly, hands moving toward the equipment at their belts. Anna stood still. Reth walked up to her and stopped. He was close, much closer than any handler had willingly stood to him without a barrier between them. His head was higher than hers. His amber eyes looked down at her face. He made no sound. He simply stood there and looked at her the way he had looked at her through the fence, as if she was the only fixed point in the world worth looking at. Anna looked back at him. Then she lifted one hand slowly and placed it against the side of his jaw. Reth leaned into it. The handler on Anna's left let out a breath that was not quite controlled. The one on her right wrote something in his log with a hand that was slightly unsteady. Neither of them moved. The session lasted 40 minutes. For all 40 minutes, Reth stayed close to Anna without aggression, without agitation, without any of the restless tension that had defined every previous interaction the compound had recorded for him. He followed her as she moved through the enclosure, not pressing against her, not demanding anything, just staying near. When she stopped, he stopped. When she moved, he moved. The relationship between them had the ease of something that had been practiced for a long time, which made no sense at all given that they had never been in the same space before today. The handlers wrote it all down. Every detail. They brought the log to Sorvek that evening and he read it at his desk without comment. He read it twice. By the end of the first week, the pattern was clear to everyone who was paying attention. Anna came each morning. Reth oriented on her arrival before the gate opened. His sessions with her produced behavioral readings that the compound's assessment tools were not entirely set up to measure, because nobody had expected to need to measure them. Aggression indicators that had been climbing steadily since Reth arrived at the compound began to drop. His responsiveness to directional cues, which had been functionally 0 for 14 months, started to register. Small things at first. He would turn when she turned. He would stop when she stopped. Nothing that looked like formal training. More like the behavior of a creature that had simply decided to pay attention to someone. Outside of Anna's sessions, Reth was still difficult. Still tense. Still not an animal that anyone else in the compound could approach without caution. But the baseline had shifted. Even the junior handlers noticed it. There was something different in the enclosure now. A quality that had not been there before. Like a room where a window had been opened. Drath watched all of it and said little. One afternoon near the end of the second week he came to the observation post beside Reth's enclosure during Anna's session. He did not come to watch Anna or Reth specifically. He came because he had seen, from across the yard, that one of the other human workers was standing at the observation window waiting for Anna's session to finish. The man's name was Frank. He was older than most of the labor exchange workers, somewhere past 50 by human count. With a broad, weathered face and the quiet manner of someone who had spent a long time doing practical work and thinking privately about most things. He was not a talkative man. Reth had noted him before without having a specific reason to speak to him. He had a reason now. Reth stopped beside him at the observation window and looked through it at the enclosure. Anna was crouched low near Reth, doing nothing in particular, not working, not giving any kind of direction. Just crouched there with one hand resting on the juvenile's shoulder while Reth sat with his eyes half closed and his plates completely flat. "You know her well," Reth said. It was not quite a question. Frank looked at him with the measuring expression of a man deciding how to answer. "Since she arrived," he said. "Was she trained with animals? On your world?" Frank thought about it for a moment. "Her family kept large dogs," he said. "Working dogs. The kind that need handling. She grew up around them." He paused and looked back through the window. "She learned early how to be around something that could hurt you without making it feel like it had to decide about you." Reth was quiet. He kept his eyes on the enclosure. "Most people," Frank continued, not looking at Reth, "when they're near something dangerous, they send it a signal. Even when they're trying not to. The body does it without permission. The animal reads it and it changes how the animal feels." He shrugged slightly. "Anna doesn't send that signal. She never has. Even when she's uncertain she just goes quiet instead of going stiff." He paused again. "The dogs always knew the difference." Reth stood at the window for a long time after Frank finished speaking. Inside the enclosure, Reth had lowered himself fully to the ground beside Anna. She had not asked him to. He had simply decided to. He lay with his massive body settled on the enclosure floor and his head turned toward her and his breathing slow and even in a way that the compound's logs had never recorded for him before. "She does not know what she is doing," Reth said quietly. "Not in the way we would mean it." "No," Frank agreed. "She just thinks she's sitting with him." Reth left the observation post shortly after and walked back across the compound to the administrative block. He went past his office and past the documentation room and kept walking until he reached a door at the back of the building that was not often opened. The archive room. It smelled of old material and dry air and the particular staleness of things that had not been disturbed in a long time. He lit the room and started looking. It took him nearly an hour to find what he was looking for, because it was not stored with the standard training records. It was in an older section, in materials that predated the current training programs by several generations. Old logs. Early compound records. Accounts written by handlers who had worked with Grakens before the formal conditioning systems had been built and standardized. He found references to something called the given bond. He read carefully. The given bond was not a trained behavior. It was not something a handler produced through technique or conditioning or any deliberate method. It was something the Graken chose. Entirely and freely chose. The old records described it in careful, specific language, a juvenile or adult Graken selecting a companion based on criteria that the early handlers had tried to identify and never fully could. The accounts described the anchor posture. They described the behavioral changes that followed. They described the way a bonded Graken performed differently from an unbound one, not just in temperament but in capability. Focused. Responsive. Effective in ways that conditioned animals rarely matched. One writer had called it the difference between a creature that obeyed and a creature that chose. The later records told a different story. As the training programs became more structured, the given bond had been written about less and less. Later scholars had called it an unreliable variable. Something that could not be standardized or replicated on demand and therefore could not be built into a training system. The newer methods had been designed to produce consistent results without depending on something as unpredictable as a Kraken's free choice. The notice went up on the handler board 3 days later. It was a single sheet, written in Drath's hand, posted at the center of the board where compound announcements of significance were always placed. Most notices on that board were practical things. Schedule changes. Equipment updates. Behavioral assessments for specific juveniles. They were read quickly and forgotten quickly because they were the ordinary business of a working compound. This one was not ordinary. The handlers who read it that morning stood in front of it for longer than usual. Some of them read it twice. A few said nothing and walked away with the look of people carrying something they had not expected to be handed. A few talked in low voices near the board until Sorvek came through and the talking stopped. Sorvek read the notice without expression. He stood in front of it for exactly as long as he needed to read it once. Then he walked to his office and closed the door behind him. The notice stated that Elder Drath was calling a formal compound declaration. All senior handlers were required to be present in the main yard at the mid-morning hour. Attendance for the human labor exchange workers was also requested. The subject of the declaration was listed in plain language at the bottom of the sheet. The bonded handler designation of the juvenile Kraken, Reth. By mid-morning the yard had filled quietly. The senior handlers stood in a loose group near the center of the open ground. 8 of them in total, all in their formal compound jackets, all with the careful expressions of people who had been thinking since they read the notice and had not finished thinking yet. The human workers stood in a separate group near the yard wall. 12 of them, some curious, some uncertain, all aware that something significant was happening without knowing exactly what. Anna stood near the back of the human group. She was in her good uniform, the one she kept clean for occasions she did not fully understand. She had been told only to be present and to be in her good uniform. She stood with her hands at her sides and watched Drath cross the yard toward the center and tried to read the shape of what was coming from the faces around her. Frank stood beside her. He said nothing. But he stood close enough that his presence was its own kind of message, and Anna was grateful for it. Drath stopped in the center of the yard and waited for the space to settle. It settled quickly. There was already a stillness in the yard that did not need to be asked for. He began to speak in the formal register, the measured, careful cadence the Valdorei used when something was being said for the permanent record. It was slower than everyday speech and more precise, and it carried a weight that even people unfamiliar with Valdorei tradition could feel in the air when they heard it. He described what had happened over the past 3 weeks. The anchor posture at the fence. The aggression trial and its result. The supervised sessions and the behavioral data they had produced. He spoke about the given bond, what it was, what the old record said about it, why it had been abandoned and why that abandonment had been a loss that the compound had not recognized as a loss until now. He spoke about all of it plainly and completely, the way a man speaks when he wants the record to be honest. Then he said Anna's name. He named her as the bonded handler of the juvenile Kraken designated Reth. He stated her standing in the compound, effective from this moment, equal to a qualified Valdorei trainer in all matters relating to Reth's care, handling, and development. He stated that this designation came not from any decision of rank or authority but from the choice of the Kraken itself, and that the compound recognized and honored that choice in accordance with its oldest traditions. He stopped speaking. The yard was completely quiet for a moment. Then the senior handlers bowed their heads. It was a short gesture, a slow forward tilt, held for just a moment. But it was deliberate and it was clear, and it was the gesture the Valdorei used when something true and significant had been witnessed and acknowledged. All 8 of them did it at the same moment without being asked, because it was what the tradition called for and because whatever else they felt about the situation, they were people who respected their traditions. Anna watched it happen and did not know what to do with it. She felt the weight of it without having words for the weight. She looked at Frank. Frank gave her a small and steady nod that meant simply, receive it. Accept it. Let it be what it is. She straightened. She nodded back at the gathered handlers, honest and simple, without performance. At the edge of the yard, Sorvek stood apart from the main group. He had placed himself slightly back from the other senior handlers, close enough to be present, far enough to have a small amount of distance. He had his arms at his sides. He had listened to every word Reth said without moving and without changing his expression, and now he stood with his eyes on the center of the yard and thought things he was not going to say out loud because they were his own and the time for saying them had already passed. He had not been wrong to object. He believed that still. The objections had been reasonable and responsible, and any careful person in his position would have made them. But the yard had answered the objections more clearly than any argument could have, and Sorvek was a man who respected clear answers even when they were not the answers he had expected. The enclosure gate opened. Reth came through it without a lead. He had been brought to the gate by two handlers who had unclipped the restraint before the gate swung open, and now he walked into the yard free, the way he had walked into the trial yard, but differently from that time. In the trial there had been tension in him from the moment he came through the gate. Now he walked with his head up and his spine plates completely flat and his amber eyes moving across the yard until they found what they were looking for. He found Anna in 4 seconds. He always found her quickly now. He crossed the yard at a steady walk. The gathered handlers on either side did not step back, though a few of them wanted to. Reth passed through the space between them without looking at any of them and stopped in front of Anna. He lowered his head until it was level with hers. His amber eyes were calm. Fully calm. The kind of calm that was not the absence of something but the presence of something, a settledness that went all the way down. Anna looked at him for a moment. Then she did what she had started doing quietly during their early sessions in the enclosure, in those first careful mornings when she was still learning what he needed and he was still learning that she was real. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead gently against the broad flat plane of his skull. It was a human gesture. It meant something between people, closeness, recognition, the particular warmth of being near someone you trusted completely. She did not know if it translated. She had never known. She had offered it to him one morning because it was the most honest thing she could think to do, and he had leaned into it, and so she had kept doing it. He leaned into it now. His massive head pressed gently back against her forehead with a care that seemed almost impossible in something his size. His eyes closed. The breath that came out of him was long and slow and complete, the kind of breath that a body releases when it has finally put something down that it has been carrying for a long time. Around them the yard was still. The senior handlers watched and no one spoke. Several of them looked at the ground, not in shame but in the way people look away from something true that catches them off guard, something that reminds them of what they got into this work for in the first place, before the protocols and the conditioning programs and the long habit of thinking about the beasts as problems to be managed. Sorvek watched from the edge of the yard. He watched Reth's spine plates, completely flat. He watched the juveniles breathing, slow and even. He watched Anna standing with her forehead pressed to the skull of a war beast that had broken handling poles and injured a handler and paced 14 months of restless angry loops in an enclosure that had never felt like anything except a place he was trapped. And he watched that same animal standing in an open yard, free, completely free, and choosing to be still. Something in Sorvek's chest moved. He could not have named it exactly. It was not regret and it was not defeat. It was more like the feeling of a door opening onto a room you had forgotten existed. He stood with it quietly and let it be what it was and did not try to push it back down. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. That night the compound was quiet in the ordinary way of working places after dark. The handlers were in their quarters. The human workers were in their block. The yard was empty and dark except for the low lights that stayed on through the night along the fence lines. In Reth's enclosure, the chains that normally ran from the wall posts to the anchor rings on the juvenile's harness were coiled and hung and used on their posts. Reth had ordered them removed from the active setup that afternoon, quietly and without announcement. It was a practical decision, he had told the handler who asked. A bonded Kraken in anchor with its chosen companion did not require the same restraint protocols as an unbound juvenile. The data supported it. The decision was logged. Reth lay in the center of his enclosure on the bare ground. He was not pacing. He was not half alert in the uneasy doze that had been the closest thing to sleep anyone in the compound had ever observed from him. He was not listening for threats or tracking the sounds of the compound around him with his amber eyes open in the dark. He was asleep. Deeply and completely asleep, his massive sides rising and falling in a rhythm that was slow and unguarded and real. His spine plates were flat against his back. His legs were loose. His face, in the low light, had the particular stillness of a creature that was not waiting for anything bad to happen. Nothing was coming. Nothing was wrong. Something in him knew that now. He did not have words for it. He did not need words for it. He only knew, in the oldest and simplest part of what he was, that he was not alone anymore. That the person who had said his name through a fence on an ordinary morning and looked at him without fear and pressed her forehead to his and meant it, that person was real, and she would come back, and the world he was in had changed into something he did not have to fight every moment of every day. He slept. And for the first time in his life, the chains were not there. And he did not miss them, because he had never needed them to stay.